Game collections, bundles, compilations, or really whatever you want to call them, are nothing new. However, most of the time, these games are still kept separate in their bundles. Individual games that you can choose from, but not Sword Art Online. They chose to do things a bit differently.
Link start.
Hey there, future VR warriors, it's me, Spammer D. So I'm just gonna go ahead and cut straight to the chase. The way this game was made, the way it was ported, the way it's all cobbled together is a bit strange. I've never seen anything like it before. And as such, it's a little bit complicated. So let's do our best to follow along. Sword Art Online Re Hollow Fragment was originally released as a Japanese PSP exclusive, titled Sword Art Online Infinity Moment, which then got re-released on the Vita as Hollow Fragment. Except, instead of just being an updated port, an entirely new alternate campaign was attached. Essentially a sequel, but not as a separate game. You can literally jump between the two with the same character, stats, and everything at will. Then the game got an international release as a download-only Vita exclusive, which of course is why no one in the West played it. Which brings us to the now, the re-release on PC and PS4. You got all that? Well, don't worry, it gets even more complicated, because there's also the in-game and out-of-game backstory that needs to be discussed. Now, I touched on this in my Who Are Licensed Games For video a while back, this game being the inspiration for that one, because the long and short of it is, this game is not kind to the uninitiated. Basically, if you haven't either watched the first 13 episodes of the anime, or at least read the first light novel, you're not gonna have any idea of the world you're in, who these characters are, or what's even going on. And while yeah, they do gloss over the backstory a bit, really, without walking into this game as a pre-existing fan, I think you're gonna miss out on a lot of the game's charm. And while I always make a point not to spoil a game's story in these reviews, as stories are subjective and a major draw for many of us, the game literally spoils the ending of the first arc, so if you don't want to be spoiled or only care about the gameplay, feel free to hop to this moment in the video. Alright, so now that you've taken the time to sit down and completely read through an entire novel, just so you'll be ready to fully 100% experience my video, let's go ahead and jump into the game. As I was saying before, Hollow Fragment is essentially two games merged into one, and as such, has two openings. Yeah, I'm serious. And they're not in logical order for newcomers, so we're gonna fix that for this discussion. So, for everyone new to SAO, the plot is basically this. 10,000 players have been trapped in a virtual reality MMORPG, where dying in the game means dying in real life. So yeah, thank God they weren't trapped in Beat Saber. And in order to escape, the players have to climb through all 100 levels of a massive floating castle the size of a freaking continent. However, thanks to a little loophole, our hero was able to free everyone at level 75. In the original story. The games, on the other hand, follow a different canon. This time around, a glitch wreaks havoc on the world, interrupting the original final battle of the arc, as well as causing a bunch of other very plot-convenient mishaps, including rewriting the Fairy Dance arc, the Gun Gale arc, and best of all, giving us even more waifus. Because every SAO game brings with it more waifus. Haters, do you see why we love this series now? The glitch also basically starts up the second game as well, transporting our MC, Kirito, to the Hollow area. Basically an area of the game not accessible to players without main character powers. And from there, you can basically tackle either story however you see fit. At its heart, SAO Hollow Fragment is a dungeon crawler. You explore, you fight enemies, you find loot. Really, it's nothing too out of the ordinary. But what makes it stand out is how each of the stories lay out their dungeons. Basically linear exploration versus open world. Yep, the Infinity Moment campaign is super linear. Basically, every floor has you completing 3 objectives, usually collecting a set number of MacGuffins,
slaying a set number of enemies, and taking down a special foe, all leading up to a boss fight. Rinse and repeat 25 times, and guess what? You win. Now there are a few, and I am being really generous here, puzzles, but that's about it. As you could probably guess, it gets very repetitive very fast. The Hollow area, however, isn't so straightforward. The Hollow area campaign actually acts more like an open world, with different paths to take and areas to discover, with it opening up further as you complete more objectives. Honestly, the biggest issue here is deciding what order you should really do things in. In my playthrough, I didn't know about the whole sequel port concept, so often I was bouncing between the two campaigns. But since the enemies are much stronger in the Hollow area, and I beat that one first, since it makes more sense story-wise, it ended up making the rest of the Infinity Moment content a real cakewalk. But that didn't deter me, because it's what's in between the dungeon crawling during your downtime where the real game's charm lies.
Or it'll be the part you absolutely hate.
And that would be the extra story segments. Now both campaigns have a decent main story to them, but they are both also a slow burn, not really having much happen until right at the end. But while you're working your way up to them, there are a lot, and I mean a lot, of the SAO cast just living, interacting, having fun. And there are some really sweet, heartfelt character moments here. And the rest of the time is just the Chad of fate itself doing everything in its power to ensure that Kirito is constantly surrounded by naked women. No, seriously, Kirito walks into a room with all of his female friends, and the game literally glitches all their clothes off. I'm not joking. Yeah, just throw Kirito into as many sexually awkward situations as possible and see what happens. This game's idea of comedy is very anime. Plus, these segments can really drag on, so if you aren't already invested in these characters, you probably aren't going to have a good time. But if you are invested, like I am, then you'll see that this is the most charming aspect of the game. And honestly, my favorite part. Because the rest of the game really doesn't have that much going for it. Like the graphics, for example. But to be fair, the visuals certainly do get a few things right. Like the CG cutscenes. Despite how few and far between they are, they still look really cool. The characters all have that solid anime aesthetic, all of the sword skills are bright and flashy with some real punch to them, and even the slightly animated stills, which were pretty common for the time, still have some charm to them. Especially when you get the special scenes. They look like they're straight out of the anime. But obviously, these are all still pretty dated. I mean, these are PSP graphics blown up to the big screen. They weren't designed to be looked at this closely, so I'm not gonna bust on them too hard. But the fact remains that even if you ignore the limitations of the time, the majority of the dungeons and fields are really bland and generic. And for a game, based on a game, where each floor can basically be anything, that's kind of disappointing. But overall though, if you can look past the limitations of the time, the visuals really aren't a problem. And the sound, it has similar issues. First off, the game is sub only, so if you don't like reading or can't speak Japanese, I don't know what to tell you. Other than that you're out of luck.
じゃあ、合わせてみるね。
That aside, the music on the other hand is, well, lacking. And the source material plays a massive role in the reason why. Say what you will about the anime's story and characters, but there is no denying that the SAO soundtrack is outstanding. But unfortunately, despite carrying the same name, none of those amazing tracks made it into Hollow Fragment, aside from the excellent OP, Crossing Fields, which I'm just gonna go ahead and blame on licensing. And once again, to be fair, on its own, the Hollow Fragment OST is pretty solid in its own right. Dungeons feel mysterious and dangerous, fights have some energy to them, virtual areas run with a techie vibe, and my personal favorite is the sappy emotional tune that plays during the tender moments. But the entire soundtrack really does feel like a cheap imitation of the shows. And like I said before, this game really does expect you to come into it with some pre-existing knowledge, so it's very likely that most players will notice it.
Or maybe they'll be too caught up in the action. Though I doubt it. The last element we really need to talk about is the combat, and it's, certainly something.
Now, the combat is the same regardless of which story missions you're doing. And the thing about it is that it's clearly trying to emulate the combat of popular real-world MMOs, like World of Warcraft. Your character will stand before the enemy and auto-attack while you select different commands. Though you do have the freedom to run around, swift dodge, block, and other options depending on how you customize your moveset. Hollow Fragment offers up a lot of options when it comes to different stat buffing skills, debuffs, attacking sword skills, how you want your allies to function, and items. And despite how many hours I sunk into this game, I feel like I only scratched the surface of what's actually there. But the thing is, I didn't really need to go much deeper. Honestly, there's probably too much here for a game that's a bit too easy and combat that's a bit too shallow. The enemies in this game don't exactly require any real strategy to beat them, despite how awesome some of these bosses might look. I found that the classic core vault strategy worked every time.
Now men, group up and hit it till it dies!
It's a shame because the combat really isn't that bad, but it's just not engaging enough for such a long game, especially one with 2 campaigns, which is probably why it was dropped in later titles. That, and the fact that the combat in the show and novels is nothing like how it is in traditional MMOs. So following that playstyle really doesn't make any sense for this series. I myself was kinda getting bored halfway through, though like with traditional MMOs, it'd probably be better in multiplayer, which this game actually has. That's right, Hollow Fragment has multiplayer, though it's mostly just missions separate from the main campaign. Good for collecting loot and just playing with others. Though of course, since there have been multiple sequels since this game came out, nobody's really playing this one. Though the game does allow you to play multiplayer missions with AI, so that's neat. And if you do find yourself really engaged in the combat, getting your friends to join would probably make for a few fun sessions. But I really wouldn't go out of my way for it. Despite its massive success in the East, Sword Art Online Hollow Fragment is a pretty tough sell in the here and now. While strong on a handheld, the graphical limitations are really exposed on the big screen, not helped by music and combat that are realistically just average. Non-SAO fans will find little to no enjoyment from this game, and it's certainly not going to be winning them over or claiming any new fans. This game was absolutely made for those who are already down with SAO. And for those of us who are, you'll find 2 enjoyable tales with lots of charm. But gameplay wise, it's still probably not worth it. But since the story sets up a split timeline that will be followed in future games, my recommendation would be to just watch a Let's Play or something and then just jump straight into one of those later titles.